Let's get started. It's my pleasure to welcome you back for our second talk of the afternoon, which already has the prize for heaviest handout for the conference. So far, true. And this talk is called Minimal Minds, Anti-Representationalism in the High Middle Ages, and our speaker is Peter John Hartman, from Loyola University, Chicago, but that doesn't clearly represent how much work he's put into actually being here, since he's on sabbatical in Hamburg this year, so he's flown all the way from Germany to be with us. So thank you for that. Let's welcome our speaker.
Well, thank you once again to the organizers and the printer for printing all of these. So the title's changed just a tiny bit. It's Wicked Minimalists. And so I always kind of get the homework assignment a little bit wrong, but I did start out thinking about this group of philosophers in the 14th and 13th century in the High Middle Ages who adopted this radically active view of the mind, motivated in part by the idea that the mind is vital or a living thing, and so more noble. And so they thought, oh, the mind can't be affected by the world. It's got to be non-passive. In a very fundamental sense, they're often called the Augustinians, broadly construed, against the Aristotelians, who thought the mind is affected, following Aristotle, that says sensing is a type of being affected, or thinking is a type of being affected. So I did start that part out right, but it turned out as I went along, these people start stripping the life out of the mind and become very wicked. So anyway, it starts out with some life, and the life will go out by the end. Okay, so I'll start with Jerry Fodor. Has a good quote here, which I'll start out. This is A1. And the handout's very long. I'm not going to read all of it. It's just for reference. So once upon a time, there was a wicked behaviorist. He was alas a mingy and dogmatic creature of little humor and less poetry, but he kept a clean attic. Each day he would climb into his attic and throw things out, for it was his ambition eventually to have almost nothing in his attic at all. Some people whispered this was his only ambition, that the wicked and behaviorist was actually just a closet ontological purist. For all I know, they were right to whisper this. Okay, so now while there weren't any wicked behaviorists among the scholastics of the High Middle Ages, sadly, there were what we might call wicked minimalists. There was a definite, albeit minority, position that sought to rid the mind of much of the furniture that was thought by the mainstream views to be necessary explanatia of our mental lives. So species, habitus, mental words, and even acts, mental acts themselves conceived of as qualities or absolute things added to the mind were chucked out. And the proponents of this view on page 2, I have at the top there, the wicked minimalists. And the main proponent is Durandus of St. Pourçain, but I managed to find some others, Richard Drayton, John Wendt, and there's a curious story about how John Merricore gets condemned for holding this view, even though he doesn't really endorse it. But anyway, it became a very popular view. It was discussed by Puritan and Rim and a bunch of other people, and occasionally adopted. Now, the wicked minimalist defends two wicked theses. The first is anti-affectionism. That's the view motivated primarily by the idea that the mind is very noble, it's active, it's a living thing. And according to this thesis, the mind is never affected during its illustrious career in the body, neither by its own efficient agency nor by the efficient agency of something outside of it, like objects. Now, an alternative way of putting this thesis is that the mind never undergoes any form of intrinsic, that is, say, non-relational change. And so it never acquires any non-relational or absolute things, such as species or habitus, or even acts themselves conceived of as qualities in the mind. And this is true for most of them at the level of intellect and at the level of sensation or senses. So this thesis, of course, is to be opposed to what I have on the handout there. It's opposed to affectionism, which is the dominant view, according to which the mind is affected and it does undergo intrinsic change. Now, affectionists itself, this is broad strokes, so don't shoot me, but affectionists themselves divide into two broad camps. or groups. There's those that suppose that the mental power, whatever power it is in question, is affected by the efficient causality of the object, at least in part as a partial cause of either a species or the act. And I call those the strong affectionists. And then there were those, and that's the dominant view. I give a chart on page 2 there, where I try to chart out some of these. So Aquinas, Ariel, Scotus, William Crathorne hold this view in various degrees. And then there were others who held a weak affectionist view that said objects can't affect the mind, but the mind still affects itself as efficient cause. And that's going to be, Peckham has this curious view where he thinks the mind produces species in itself when the object's there. And of course, Peter John Livy holds this view where the mind produces its own acts and stuff when the object's present to it. So those, though, I consider them all affectionists. They think the mind's affected. The anti-affectionist denies that, right? The second wicked thesis is what I call anti-assimilationism or anti-representationalism. And that's the thesis according to which the content of a mental perceptual act, at least, is not, the one about the world, is not even in part fixed by likenesses in the head, be them in the mind or in the brain or organs, which is, of course, opposed to the thesis of assimilationism, according to which the mind is. And these have various flavors, which I list, and I'll come back to in a moment. Now, the common opinion of the schoolmen of during those days was some combination of affectionism and assimilationism. However, as we'll see, there were some anti-affectionists who accepted assimilationism, a fellow named Prosper de Reggio Emilia and another fellow named James Viterbo. And there were some affectionists who rejected assimilationism, and at least at the level of perception, and that would be William Ockham and Godfrey and Peter John O'Livy. Now, the wicked minimalism combines both of the negative theses here, which is what makes it so wicked. And so that's where the chart sort of comes in a little bit. You can see the wicked minimalists there down in the right-hand corner. Okay, so or it makes it a non-starter. So after all, if the mind is not affected and does not undergo any intrinsic change, then how is it that we can explain, first off, how our mental acts themselves come about and what those mental acts are themselves about, what the content of our thinking is. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about causation and then turn to content. And I'll close with maybe a few words on whether these wicked minimalists might be wicked behaviorists. So causation first. So anti-affectionism is a combination of a negative thesis and a positive thesis. The negative thesis is that a mental power is not affected. And the positive thesis is going to answer the question, well, how is it that a mental act comes about? The negative thesis follows from two metaphysical axioms that were thought to govern efficient causal transactions. The nobility axiom, which I list there in the handout, from which it follows that our mental powers being so noble and so on cannot be affected by the efficient agency of objects. And the act potency axiom, from which it follows that mental powers cannot be affected by the efficient agency of themselves. So quickly, here's how those arguments went, and I'm not going to go into too many details on them. So according to the nobility axiom, what is less noble cannot affect what is more noble as an efficient cause. And since most objects, like visible qualities and things like that, and their downstream effects, like species in the medium and so on, are less noble than minds and the vital living powers of the senses, it follows that objects and their downstream effects cannot affect mental powers as efficient causes. Now, according to the act potency axiom, nothing one and the same can be both actually put and potentially the same thing at the same time. It follows from this axiom that a mental power cannot affect itself as efficient cause. So the simple version of this argument goes like this. An efficient cause must be actually whatever it is that the patient is potentially, and so if a mental power were to efficiently cause something in itself, like a vision, it would thus be actually seeing as the agent and potentially seeing as the patient at the same time. There's a more complicated version of the argument that goes like this. Either the efficient causation in question is univocal, in which case the above argument goes through, or it's equivocal, in which case self-affection is still impossible, since an equivocal agent must be more noble than the corresponding patient, but nothing can be more noble than itself. Now, I'm not going to fuss about those. The affectionists obviously reject one or the other or both of them. But that's the negative thesis that sort of anti-affectionism is built on for these people. Now, the positive thesis, every anti-affectionist has to answer this question. Well, how does a mental act come about? Mental acts are, after all, episodic. I don't always think or see all the time. But if neither the mental power nor the object or one of its downstream effects can function as the efficient cause of our mental acts, then there must be some other explanation or cause of the occurrence of a given mental act. The usual solution for anti-affectionists is to claim that the cause of a mental act is the object, but not as an efficient cause, but as an exciting or sine qua non cause. And B1 and B3 lay out two representative cases there where James of Viterbo and Durand both argue for that thesis. I won't read it, but they're there. However, it does not excite the power to affect itself as efficient cause either. That's what weak affectionists like Olivier and Peckham hold. Rather, the object just functions as a kind of remover of an impediment to the natural operation the power has, namely the impediment being the absence of the object. So the chief analogy they use, and this is in almost all of them, is a rock's downward motion. And this is B2 and B4, which I won't read, but I have them there. Suppose a heavy rock rests upon a plank of wood. Once we remove the plank, the rock falls down. Now, what caused the rock to fall down? What caused the downward motion in the rock? Our answer will, it's true, appeal to an efficient cause. Whatever efficient cause efficiently caused the rock to be heavy in the first place, so that could be God or whatever generated heaviness in the rock, whatever made the rock in the first place how it is. However, the direct or proximate explanation or cause of the rock's downward motion is, one, the heaviness in the rock, that's a form that the rock possesses whose natural motion is downwards motion, and two, the removal of the impediment, the plank. And neither one nor two is an efficient cause of the downwards motion in the rock for them. So too in cases where an object is required. So for instance, the hotness in the campfire, fire is hot, and it has hotness in it. It's a form that it possesses, and the form's natural operation is to burn burnable objects. Together with the presence of a hot dog, for example, a burnable object, they're what directly explain the occurrence of the campfire's natural operation of burning a hot dog. We might say that the rock's heaviness or the fire's hotness manifests or realizes its innate potential for downwards motion or burning when conditions are right. Once the extrinsic impediments have been removed, and if an object is required, once the object is present, such natural operations or motions ensue without the need for some further efficient cause of those operations or motions. So too with our mental powers, both sensory and intellectual, which are forms whose natural operations like seeing, smelling, thinking, and so on require objects. Once the visible object is present to the visive power, the power able to see, sight, vision ensues without any efficient cause. So indeed, at least some anti-affectionists went so far as to simply reduce the mental act, ontologically speaking, to simply the relation of presence that obtains between a present visible object and sight. And I give you an example of that, C1 through C5, but I want to draw your attention to C3, which is Peter of Pellude quoting or interpreting Durand, because they never come out and say it in so many words, but this is what Peter of Pellude says. He says, this is C3, which I'll just read quickly. So Durand says that the relationship of presence is formally the cognition. He's talking about angels in this case, but humans go on as well. And as far as the whole of what it adds to the power. So a mental act, this is where they're starting to strip the life out of the mind. Mental acts are just relations between minds and present objects. Okay, so the big question though is, when is an object present to the mind or mental power? Now I'm going to punt this question to myself and I'll catch it in the next section, but suffice it to say it is not in virtue of anything internal to the mind. It will have to do with what goes on outside the mind, either in the head or in the world, since objects will come to be present and then absent, even though the mind remains intrinsically the same and unaffected. Okay, so much for causation. Let's turn to content at this point. So what fixes the aboutness or content of a mental act? Like, what makes it a thinking about blue balls rather than brown elephants? So here the anti-affectionists start to divide themselves into two distinct camps. Those who still endorse assimilationism and the thesis that the content is fixed, at least in part, by a likeness, and those who do not. The assimilationist camp itself divides into two further factions. On the one side, there are nativists, like James of Viterbo, who famously holds that such likenesses, since they cannot be acquired, they must thus be innate. He calls them idoneitates, or propensities, placed into the soul by God at creation. That's D1 through D3 on the handout, which I won't read as well, but it's very funny because he says, and of course I'm being Platonic here and endorsing a dogma of Plato, but Augustine liked Plato, so it's not that bad. On the other side, there are what I'm going to call the organists. And the organists are people like Prosper de Reggio, who argue that, and this is D4, which I also won't read, but it's an interesting quote. He argues that species or likenesses are received in our organs, or in particular in the nerves, but not in the mental power itself. But these species received in the nerves, they're the representations that everybody's talking about when they talk about species in the mind, and that's D4 in the handout. While both views are very interesting in their own right and likely wicked in their own right, neither would count as a wicked minimalist. The nativist just fills our mind up with more stuff, more furniture, and the organist simply moves the furniture from the mind into the head. Both are still committed to, in particular, an internalist thesis, the representationalist thesis, that what a mental act is about is at least in part a function of what goes on inside the head. Now, okay, the wicked minimalist, by contrast, rejects assimilationism, at least at the level of perception. So on this score, they are like a certain group of affectionists, notably Godfrey of Fontaine and William of Ockham, who also reject assimilationism at the level of perception, or intuitive cognition is their fancy word. For Ockham and Godfrey, the content of such perceptual acts, when I see a visible color, is fixed by the efficient agency of the object, the visible color itself, the ball out there in the world. And so Ockham and Godfrey seem to endorse what we would nowadays call a causal theory of content. And this is E1 through E4, where they, at least Ockham clearly says, look, it's not assimilation, it's causation. And that sounds like it's going to be a causal theory. And then Godfrey's, if anybody's read Godfrey, he doesn't give sound bites like Ockham does, but I give you the text there. He says, I think the same thing. However, our wicked minimalists also reject, indeed they must reject, the efficient causal theory of content, since they, unlike Godfrey and Ockham, do not think that the mind is affected by the efficient agency of the object. So they endorse, the wicked minimalists endorse instead what I call the presence theory of content. What a mental act is about is either fully, in the case of perception, or partly, in the case of indirect forms of thought, explained by the relation of presence between the mental power and the object. So I'm going to first go over presence theory in the case of perception, and then I'm going to briefly gesture at how the second part of the story kind of goes. So the first question that the presence theorist about content, about perceptual content, must answer is the one that I punted to myself a bit ago. So when is it that a thing or an object is present to a perceptive mental power? The quick answer here is when that thing exists and it's located at the right spot and the conditions are right for it to be sensed. The long answer is this. So an object that can be sensed by an outer sensory power, so a blue ball, the blueness of the ball, is present to that power when it is what I will call present at hand, to the organ in which that mental power resides, to the eyes or the whatever optical nerve or something. Now, presence at hand is not strictly speaking literal presence next to or in the organ, since what is in or next to the eye, for example, is not sensed. Rather, what is sensed is something a bit further away, but not too far away. So it would be the blue ball on the table in the back, or that orange backpack there. On the other side of the room, or the heat in my campfire, right? Not the heat that's right there next to me. And Duran says that very clearly in F1, but they all kind of agree on that point. So we might define presence at hand, and this is defined there on the handout, as follows. An object is present at hand to an outer sense organ when all the natural conditions for that object to be the actual ultimate efficient cause of a species in the organ have been met. So for instance, the color of the ball is present at hand when it is located within my field of vision, the intervening air and my organ are suitably disposed, they're diaphanous and illuminated and whatever else, and there's no intervening opaque obstacle or body or other natural obstacles. Now we can spell out the details here of presence at hand in a variety of ways, preferably by going to the relevant experts in the relevant departments. What matters is that the object is present at hand to an organ when it's present at hand, then it is thus present to the mental power that resides in that organ, and thus it is sensed. So note importantly that the object would still be present at hand even if God were to set things up such that the object does not in fact efficiently cause any effects or species whatsoever in the organ or medium. Such species on this theory are just side effects, so to say, of the more fundamental fact that the object is present at hand to the organ. So Durand writes, and this is F3 on the handout, F2 and 4 say something similar. F2 is especially interesting for those who want to do their homework on this, but this is basically his sum, F3, and I'll read this one out. So he says, thus it is clear that no species exists in the eye for the purpose of representing to our mental power for sight a color so that it is seen. Even though the external color does impress a species upon the medium and also upon the eye, because they have the same diaphanous character, still the species does nothing with respect to the vision, that is to say, it doesn't cause it, or even in part, nor does it represent to sight a color so that it is seen. Okay. Well, what about our intellect? It doesn't have an organ, and so it would seem that it's not present at hand to anything at all. Durand and Richard Drayton hold that the intellect is present to whatever is present to the senses, that is, to whatever is present at hand to the outer sense organs. So G1 through G6, and especially, I think, G6 in the italicized parts, which I can't get into right now, but I think that's what he's saying there in those texts. I call this parasitic presence. Note that this parasitic presence allows Durand and Drayton to countenance a kind of intellectual intuitive cognition. Although on Durand's reading of the distinction, we shouldn't call it intuitive, we should still call it abstractive, since it requires a conceptually prior sensation, but that sensation's about the same thing. When the blue ball is present at hand to my eyes, it is seen by my eyes. And then, or at the same time, or just whatever, the intellect, through its parasitic presence, is directly intellectually aware of it. So that gives you intuitive cognition, even if he doesn't want to call it that. So one cheap way to think about presence at hand is to think of it as the sort of presence that's required on Occam and Godfrey's view, who pop for action at a distance. So they say that blue ball can just act over a distance on my intellect, and you don't need species. So it's the same sort of whatever distance that ball needs to be, that's the distance that needs to be for presence at hand. It's just that for Occam and Godfrey, obviously, the ball acts efficiently upon me. But for the wicked minimalist, the presence at hand relationship is sufficient. So for Occam, when the object's present at hand, it then efficiently causes a mental act. But for our wicked minimalist, when it's present at hand, that's it. The mental act, then the relationship obtains. You don't need to say anything more. It's sufficient not just for explaining the outer perception, the vision, but it's also sufficient for fixing the content of the mental act itself. Right? It's about that, because that relation, no efficient causal relation is required, and no assimilation, much less assimilation. So indeed, one of Durand's arguments against Godfrey's view is that efficient causal relation can't fix the content of the perceptual act. So consider God. Everyone at the table admits that God can stand in for a secondary efficient cause and bring about the effect that that cause would have efficiently caused without it. So on Occam and Godfrey's efficient causal theory, we should admit that God can efficiently cause an intuitive cognition of the blue ball or whatever, or Fido's or Felix's color, that Felix's color would have caused. Now, would this intuitive cognition still be about Felix's color in the case where God brings it about? Now, if we better not answer yes, if we want to say that efficient causality is what fixes the content of the act. And yet Occam and Godfrey both say yes. So they can't hold that mental act is about this rather than that, because this rather than that is the efficient cause of it, QED, right? So Godfrey, and this is, Godfrey as Durand reads them, and this is H1 on the handout, which I'm unfortunately going to paraphrase as well. Durand thinks that Godfrey is a closet present theorist, or just being incoherent. So Godfrey insists that while God can efficiently cause an intuitive cognition about Felix's color, God cannot do this if Felix's color does not exist, since the intuitive cognition that God would have caused is related to Felix's color in such a way that Felix's color must exist. And H1 is Durand paraphrasing Godfrey's answer, and then I give you Godfrey actually does say that. And then Durand's criticism, which is H2 there, is basically, well, what relationship? So if the intuitive cognition must be related to Felix's color, even though it's not efficiently related through efficient causation, then what relationship is this? It can't be the relationship of efficient causality, nor can it be any relation that depends upon that relationship. So it looks like the relation Godfrey has in mind is simply the relation of presence at hand, and so Godfrey is a closet presence theorist. Now, Occam also answers yes to our question. God can do that. But unlike Godfrey, he has no problem with the idea that the object might not even exist in such a case. The divinely infused intuitive cognition is still about Felix's color, even if Felix's color does not exist, since for Occam it still gives rise to a true judgment about Felix's color, namely that Felix's color doesn't exist. And Occam says that H3 through H5 on the handout, and this is sort of well-trod ground for Occam scholars. So it looks like Occam too must also abandon the efficient causal theory of content. Now, Claude Panaccio, an Occam scholar, argues that he does and replaces it with the counterfactual theory of content, which commits parsimonious Occam to a plethora of possibilia. Susan Brower-Toland, on the other hand, argues that he does not abandon the efficient causal theory of content, but that on his view, to say that the content of an intuitive cognition is fixed by efficient causality is to say that each singular effect, even if it's brought about by God, intrinsically has by its very nature a disposition to be caused by this rather than that singular efficient cause. And so the intuitive cognition of Felix's color intrinsically has something in it that says I'm caused by Felix, or I should be caused by Felix's color, even if God causes it. And so Occam's efficient causal theory of content is not an externalist theory at all. There's something internal to the mind that fixes the content. So Durand, for his part, and this is H6, which is also an interesting text, but I won't read it, thinks that such a view, like Occam's, is just simply absurd on phenomenological grounds. What would it be like to smell a smell that does not exist? Right? He just doesn't think, he thinks efficient causal theories entail that, and that's the dead end. So what do our wicked minimalists say about God? So on their view, God cannot make an intuitive cognition about Felix's color for the very simple reason that God cannot make a relationship without its relata. Durand, for instance, writes on H7, which I will read, if something is not a relationship, then it can exist without anything else by divine power. That's a weird way of putting the point, but he goes on and on about how God can't create relations without the relata. Indeed, on their view, since the presence of at-hand relationship itself requires a number of necessary conditions, if God wants to make me see or intuitively cognize or intellectually perceive the blue ball, God has to create the blue ball at the right spot, turn the lights on, and make sure the medium and the organ are suitably diaphanous. And this is H8 on the handout. Even though God can take the place of any given secondary efficient cause, such that without that secondary efficient cause, God can make whatever God makes by means of it, nevertheless, God cannot take the place of other extrinsic causal or non-causal relationships. After all, God could not make a volition without a cognition or a vision without the object that terminates that vision. So I think this has gotten a little bit complicated, so let me sum up. Our wicked minimalists defend the externalist theory of content in the case of perception, both intellectual and sensory. A direct perceptual act occurs in both the outer senses and the intellect when a thing is present at hand to the outer senses. And it is this relation of presence at hand that fixes the aboutness of the perceptual act. It is the perceptual act. And it's not going to be a relation of efficient causality, much less anything inside the head like a likeness or resemblance or species. Okay. So, good. So much for that. But our wicked minimalists are very wicked. There are no likenesses in the mind involved in overtly non-perceptual or indirect forms of thought either, as when I remember or imagine or compose, divide, abstract universals, and so on, since they hold that there's no habitus or mental words or species or anything like that in the mind. The mind is never affected. It never acquires anything. So how's the content of that sort of stuff going to get itself fixed? Now, the wicked minimalist is not completely insane. The content of such acts is fixed at least in part by the presence of something to an inner sense organ, a chamber of the brain, as one of them puts it. Now, I call this presence in the head, and that's on the handout there. So something is present in the head to an inner sense organ, as some chamber in the brain, when the object exists in a corporeal or vital spirit, and that corporeal spirit is next to the inner sense organ, a chamber in the brain. So what is this something? Durand is not original here. In fact, he plagiarizes a huge chunk of Aquinas on some of these quotes. This is I1 through 3 on the handout. This something that's present to the inner chamber, to one of the inner organs, is an impression or a species that outside sense objects brought about in our various organs. So, for example, these species, remember, did nothing at all in the case of direct perception. They were just side effects. But they do have a role to play now with other forms of cognition, like remembering. So, for instance, the impression that Felix's color leaves behind on my eye, or in the nerves or whatever, somehow works its way into these corporeal spirits, which are very subtle bodies, he says, which themselves move around and flow in the body, or at least in the brain, with literal locomotion, much as the blood and humors do. And he's not being totally crazy here. He's quoting Aquinas for parts of this. Well, it could still be crazy. And occasionally come to be next to various chambers of the brain wherein the inner senses reside. So once such a corporeal spirit in which these impressions or species reside is next to such a chamber of the brain, that impression, so the impression of Felix's color, is sensed by an inner sense power. That is, the inner sensory power senses or quasi-perceives, right? There's a kind of quasi-perceptual relationship there, the impression itself inside the head. From this, we apparently, Durand thinks, can explain the phenomena of sensory remembering, imagining, and even hallucinations and demon deceptions. Or at least, maybe not deceptions, but when demons want to tell us stuff, they can fiddle with our corporeal spirits. Recall, too, that the intellect is parasitically present to whatever is present to a sense organ. And so the intellect will also be parasitically present to whatever is present in the head as well, right? So not only when I see the blue ball out there in the world is the intellect also present to it, but also when the image of the blue ball comes up, the intellect is also present to it. Okay, so at least part of the content of non-perceptual acts is going to be fixed by a presence of something, the impression or species of Felix's color, for instance. That's at least part of my memory of Felix's color. But how does the rest of the content get itself fixed? And not just Felix's color, but Felix himself and doghood and all the other stuff that we do. Well, that's another story for another day. But it's going to be a story that I'm going to kind of gesture at here. It involves a particular interesting interpretation of what Durand calls, and others, the via sensus memoriae and experientiae, sometimes the via inductionis or via experientiae, that we can find in Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 1. And this would be J1 through J6, where he talks about the role here. But quickly and roughly, what Durand says, and other people hold this view too, but on his interpretation, Aristotle is not talking about an agent intellect that somehow abstracts a universal from the phantasms, but rather he's talking about how our repeated sensory experiences with sensory effects that appear to us eventually result in us developing a skill or habit at reliably detecting the similarities between and the causes behind those effects. And I think J1 is an interesting discussion of this, which I will read. So he's talking about Christ and whether Christ knows everything without having to experience it, whether Christ knows it like angels do. So he says, well, from the mere vision of the celestial bodies, Christ, unlike an angel, cannot grasp their abilities, but rather he achieves this through repeated experiences with their effects. And here's kind of this phrase that he says over and over again. After all, from many sensations comes memory, from many memories comes experience, from many experiences come the universal, which is the foundation of art and science, as is said at the beginning of metaphysics. And you can see in J2 through J6, he puts this to use. He says that this process gives us evident knowledge of universals and so on. Okay, indeed, Durand wrote a popular treatise on habituation or habitus, where he attempted to defend the thesis that while we do attribute such skills that we develop like this, habitus, to the intellect and other mental powers, ontologically speaking, they do not exist in a mental power as in a subject. Rather, they reside in the ostensive power, or memory, or something like that, the brain, which governs the flow of those corporeal spirits and can obey the will, and so it can be trained to ensure that various species impressions are presented in a certain order to our inner sensory powers and to the intellect through parasitic presence. And so in a quote I actually don't have on the handout, he says, this is how we train dogs to associate pain with bread held out in the left hand by whacking it on the nose enough or whatever. Its little phantasms or the little species get organized in the ostensive power of the dog so that it develops these habits to associate pain with the bread. And so too with us, if we see adulterers, sadly, or thieves being hung, we associate pain, I guess, with that. It's the sort of thought. So I am going to, and so too, he says, and this is J7, which I think is just an interesting quote, so, and I have time to read it out, I think. So he says, thus it is clear that habitus existing in the power that shows or proposes objects, that's that ostensive power, whatever you want to call it. Prosper wrote an entire treatise trying to locate it, which ventricle of the brain it's located in. But it's sufficient with respect to theoretical or speculative scientific acts. That's science, like geometric acts and mathematical stuff. And this, together with a bodily disposition acquired from moral acts, is sufficient with respect to moral acts, or actions, really, like courage and stuff, courageous acts. The second thesis is shown, namely that we should attribute habitus to the intellect, or sensory appetite or intellective appetite. Since a habitus only explains an aspect of that act, for example, its promptness or its ease, we should attribute a habitus to the power whose act it mainly explains an aspect of. Thus, all habitus, both theoretical and practical, ought to be attributed to the intellect or the appetite, even though ontologically speaking, they do not exist in them as in a subject. And if this is what Aristotle meant when he maintained that there are habitus in the intellect or in the appetite, then his view was correct. And it seems to me, however you want to translate that little phrase, the humility clause, that this is what he meant, since the philosopher in his ethics talks as a moral philosopher, not as a natural philosopher. And since for morality, it does not matter wherein such habitus exist as in the subject, provided, however, that we are disposed better or worse with respect to the act whose aspect a habitus explains. Therefore, the moral philosopher attributes a habitus to the power whose act it explains an aspect of, even though the habitus does not exist in that power as in a subject. However, when Aristotle talks as a natural philosopher, when he takes off his moral philosopher hat and puts on his natural philosophy hat, namely in Physics, Book 7, he plainly says that scientific knowledge comes about in us, even though no intellectual power in us changes, which could not be the case if scientific knowledge were in the intellect as in a subject, especially if it were something non-relational. And Aristotle explicitly says this using examples, that it is merely in virtue of a real bodily change that not only the application of scientific knowledge, but also its acquisition comes about in us. Okay, now this looks to be the start, at least, of something very wicked indeed. Okay, so let's wrap up. While not a wicked behaviorist about sensory perception does not reduce without remainder to a theory of learning, since the outer senses do not learn on Durand's and these people's view, and so there are no habits even to be attributed to them. It isn't hard to imagine that such wicked minimalists would not recoil in terror at the sight of a wicked behaviorist, fellow attic sweepers and all that. On their view, nothing really goes on in the mind. There is no intrinsic changes, no qualities, no species, no likenesses, no habitus, no mental words, or even acts themselves conceived of as qualities in the mind. The mind just enters into different relations to things in the world or things in the brain, and that's about as much as we need to say about the ghost in the machine. Now, there's a few stories as to how Durand came to acquire the sobriquet Resolutissimus, the most resolute doctor, or why his tombstone reportedly reads Durus Durandus. An older version of the Catholic Encyclopedia from 1909 tells us that this was, quote, owing to his strenuous advocacy of certain opinions novel to the schoolmen of his day. My own view is that it was because he was stubborn and refused to change his mind, even in the face of multiple condemnations, on this point in particular, from his order, and later in life, a papal commission, because he pissed the Pope off. But perhaps, if anything I've said above is true, it was because he couldn't change his mind. For in a strict sense, minds do not change. Durand was, to return to our quote from Jerry Fodor that we started things off with, a mingy and dogmatic creature of little humor and less poetry, but he kept a clean attic. While likely not a wicked behaviorist, Durand and those wicked minimalists who followed in his wake offer us a radical alternative theory of mind that's at once bizarre and I think somewhat promising.